soundboards are working. No support. Okay, I heard that time. Was it mine or was it Kel's? Let's see. I don't... Oh, the ads are still running, aren't they? Oh, what is a charger bug? I don't know what a charger bug is. Anyway, it is Thursday, so it is time for mysteries. I have to adjust myself on the screen again because nothing seems to stay consistent, especially when it comes to me moving back and forth away from my camera. But here we are, once again in the bookstore. I can tell you that I am still trying to finish to get book 2. I've at least one full story just today. I have 2 more stories left, then I get to do the editing, and then send it in and hope they let me publish. I may do the first round on Blurb again with a Arliss cover. I haven't decided since Blurb still hasn't paid me for the first book. Because they have a minimum threshold of $25, and I only got like 7 or 8. I caught the charger bug. Again, I have no idea what a charger bug is. Okay, now it's saying that everyone's back from ad break, and in comes Guilty. Hey Guilty, how you doing? So are you on your way to work, or do you actually have a night off, or what? What's up? What's up with my werewolf brethren? I'm gonna ask this question. Guess I'm in a place. Okay, I didn't hear it this time. I don't know what's going on with audio. You're on the bus? I don't miss riding buses. That's weird, because I'm hearing them play when I play them from the links in OBS, but when I play them from the stream, it doesn't. It's like, I heard it that time. Ooh, motion sickness? Never a good thing. Okay, that's just extremely confusing then. Because it's letting me play it when I hit the exact same redeems and my Twitch chat, yeah, like that. But when I tried to do it from the browser, it didn't. So I don't know what's going on with this stuff. Okay, you try one. Okay, I heard it. It showed on the screen, but did you hear it? Oh, well. Ads will do that. Which is strange, because I do the 3 minutes worth of ad to get rid of pre-roll ads. And the ads, according to Kel, ended like a minute or two ago. So I don't know why it's showing ads again. Okay. Dude, where are you? We've got some work to do now. Okay. Did that go through? Okay, so it's just me. But Scooby-Doo is always a good one to play on Thursdays because that's when we do mysteries. Like, wow, man! Okay. So we're going to try to cover at least 2 more stories from Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. Because they tend to be a little bit longer. So let us skip over to the study. And frankly, I want to do mysteries because I just like wearing this hat. Oh, the fireplace sounds a little bit loud to me. Though, I don't know, can you hear the fan that I have going on in the background? Because we were in the 90s again today. And it has not cooled down yet. Well, not much. It's still in the 80s right now. But again, I can't tell if my microphone's picking up the fan. It doesn't look like it's registering it a whole lot. It's only giving me 1 bar. Whereas my speech usually goes up to 3 or 4. Usually on 2. I'd have to figure out how to, filter it out. But you can hear me and the fan? Okay. I'm not sure how well I can filter out the fan because, let me do threshold. but I'm not sure how much that's going to do. Yeah, because right now it's registering the microphone to about half. And really, I don't want to turn off the fan because it is hot. And I'm too broke to turn on the air conditioner. And again, thinking of broke, I am trying to get book 2 finished. I'm hoping to get it submitted in time for it to be released on the anniversary of 1, which would be great, because they're technically part of a series, and one a year would be nice, but it really shouldn't take me this long to write fairy tales since I already know them. And admittedly, last year I did do a lot of just copying, but this year I am actually typing most of them out just because I hate going back to fixed language. I just soon do it while I'm in the process. Which also means I've extended some stories like 4 or 5 pages. Because I want exposition. A lot of the fairy tales are just more summaries than anything else. There's no dialogue or anything else that would make it easy to see the story, so I've gone through the last 2 stories and added to them considerably. That's why the book, even though I am 2 stories short of even finishing it, and it is 2 stories fewer than book 1, I am already 10 pages past what I did on the first book. And then, of course, I'm going to do another book that I'm just going to combine them all, but, still. If you don't have the book, feel free to borrow it. If you do have the book, thank you. If I get enough of these books out, I'll possibly switch over to other stories too, but right now I'm just doing the fairy tales. And I'm trying to keep running off of the list that I originally wrote when I started streaming the fairy tales and trying to put them in that order. Which, coincides with the Jack Sipes book I have, because, that's what I was reading when I started. Before I was, paid to do it, I was reading not so copyright-free copy, but the stories themselves have been, centuries old. But anyway, let's get into the stories from the 1920s. The good old Gaslight Mysteries, which are the rivals of Sherlock Holmes. I don't know if you ever wondered, that's why I put one of the topics is Gaslight Mysteries. Because it's the same time period, it's the 1920s. Well, in this case, this one actually says it starts in the 1890s. But they're written in the early 1900s. So, first story for the evening. Stories from the Diary of a Doctor by L.T. Mead and Clifford Halifax, M.D. Without witnesses. In the October of 1890, I went to pay a short visit to my friends, the Brabosians of Pembrokeshire in Cornwall. I could only spare a week out of town, and looked forward to my visit with the pleasure which a busy man must feel when he can relax his labors for a short time. Brabazon was an old college friend, and on the first evening of my stay we had many memories to revive and many friends to talk over. We sat until the small hours in his smoking room, and it was early morning before we retired to bed. Just as I was leaving the room, he said to me, "By the way, you will find some disturbing elements at work here. I know you are fond of attributing everything to some psychological cause. I wonder what you would say to the love affairs of Randall, Charlatan, and Miss Farnham." I naturally asked what my host meant. "Well, Randall and Carleton are both desperately in love with the same girl," he replied. "Did you not notice the state of affairs this evening at dinner?" I naturally noticed Miss Farnham, I answered at once. It would be difficult not to be attracted to so striking a personality. Barbara Farnham is, without exception, the most dangerous girl in my acquaintance, cried Brabazon, with a slight laugh. But her advent on the scene, Randall and Carleton were the best possible friends. Now they are Dragger's Dawn. I confess I did not particularly observe them, I answered. Oh, they are just ordinary young fellows, replied Brasberton. I am sorry for Carleton, of course, for I don't think he has a ghost of a chance with Miss Farnham. He is not particularly good-looking, and he has the misfortune of also being poor. Randall is a handsome lad, and has considerable expectations. His father is Lord Hartmore, but the fact is, I don't think the girl means to marry either of them. She is simply playing one against the other for her own means. She is a handsome witch, and a dangerous one. She plays as carelessly with edged tools, as carelessly and unconcernedly as a baby would with its rattle. I could say nothing further. Barbazon conducted me from the room and wished me a good night. I sat down by the fire and thought in an idle manner over the events of the evening. There was a very large house party at Pincorn. Shooting was going on vigorously, and cub hunting had begun. Some of the guests were acquaintances of mine. In short, I looked forward to a pleasant evening in this genial house. As I laid my head on my pillow, I thought, but without any especially keen interest, of Brabazon's story about the disturbing elements which were now agitating the air of this otherwise peaceful mansion. 2 young men were in love with the same girl. Surely the situation was a very ordinary one. Such a complication happened daily. I wondered why Brabazon should have troubled himself to mention such an ordinary event, but as I was dropping off to sleep, I saw rising up before me in my mind's eye the proud, beautiful face of Barbara Farnham, and a kind of intuition told me that these commonplace incidents might assume a more form of tragedy in her cruel and careless hands. I dreamt of Miss Farnham that night, and came down to breakfast the next morning with my curiosity considerably aroused about her. She was in the room when I entered, and was idly helping herself to a cup of coffee, which she carried to a distant window where a small table was also laid for breakfast. She sat down, and, sipping it leisurely, looked around her with a careless glance. Her eyes fell on me. She smiled and motioned me to approach. Pray bring your breakfast to this table, she said in a light tone. I was immensely interested in you when I heard you were coming. I adore doctors, particularly if they are clever. Are you going to ride this morning? I answered in the affirmative and asked if she was fond of horses. Fond? She replied, a flash of added warmth lighting up her particularly red-brown eyes. I'm going to whisper a secret to you. I never could compare horses and human beings. I consider the horse an infinitely nobler creature. I laughed, and we entered into an animated conversation. While we were talking, Carleton came into the room. He was a squarely built young man with deeply set dark eyes, and a determined chin and mouth. His figure was slightly above the middle height. He was extremely spare, but he had good shoulders and was well set up. As soon as he appeared in sight, Miss Farnham, by almost imperceptible movement, slightly turned her back to him, and her talk with me became even more animated and full of wit than before. Her gay, light laugh must have reached Carleton, who came straight across the room to her side. "You are in my favorite seat," he said. "Yes," she replied, "and Dr. Halifax is having breakfast with me." Then she turned to continue the conversation with me while Carleton stood perfectly erect and silent by her side. "Why don't you eat something?" she said to him presently. "There is time enough," he answered. Finding he would not go away, she tried to draw him into conversation, but he was evidently not in the humor to take himself agreeable. His answers were confined to monosyllables, and to some of Miss Farnham's remarks he did not reply at all. I confess that I began to think of him an unmitigated bore. A change was, however, quickly to take place in the situation. Randall, the other lover, appeared on the scene, and his coming acted like a flash of sunshine. He was a gay, handsome, debonair-looking young fellow. He had good teeth, good eyes, and a genial smile, a hearty manner. His voice was musical, and he knew well how to use it. He nodded carelessly to one or two acquaintances when he entered the room, and then he came straight to Miss Farnham's table. She shook hands with him and nodded a good, cheerful good morning to Carleton and me. "That is right," he said, smiling brightly at the handsome girl. "You promised to reserve a seat for me at this table, and I see you have kept your word. Have you done breakfast, Carleton?" "I had something an hour ago," replied Carleton. Randall went to a sideboard to help himself to a generous portion of a dish which was being kept hot with a spirit lamp. On his return, our conversation became gayer and more lively than ever. I must confess I saw nothing to object to in Miss Farnham's manners. I could not imagine why Brasbison spoke of her as a dangerous witch. She tried to be polite to both men, or rather she was polite without effort, but there was not a trace of the flippant in her manner of bearing. Her beauty was undoubtedly of a remarkable order. Her eyes were her most striking characteristic. There was a great deal of red in their brown, which was further accentuated by the red-brown of her long eyelashes. The eyes were capable of every shade of expression, and could be at times as eloquent and as full of meaning as those of that bewitching creature, the collie. Her eyebrows were dark and delicately penciled. Her hair was tawny in shade. She had quality zealots, and she wore picturesquely round her stately and statuesque head. In some lights, that brilliantly colored hair looked as if a sunbeam had been imprisoned in it. Her complexion was of a warm, creamy whiteness. Her figure was slight and graceful, but for her eyes she might have been simply remarked as a handsome girl. But those eyes were beautiful, and lifted her completely out of the commonplace. We had finally finished breakfast when I was startled by seeing Randall suddenly press his hand to his eyes and turn so white that I thought he was going to lose consciousness. He recovered himself almost immediately, however, and so completely that no one else remarked the circumstance. Miss Farnham rose from the breakfast table. "I'm going to ride with you, Dr. Halifax," she said, nodding brightly at me. "I shall come downstairs in my habit in half an hour." She was crossing the room to speak to some of the other guests when Carleton came up to her. "I want to say something to you," he said. "Can we go to some room where we shall be undisturbed?" His words were distinctly audible, not only to me but to several other people in the room. Randall in particular heard them, and I could see that he was waiting anxiously for the reply. "I want to ride this morning. I have no time for private confidences." replied Miss Farnham, in a distinctly vexed tone. I won't keep you long, answered Carlton. What I have to say is of great importance, at least to me. I will give you 10 minutes after lunch. Will that suffice? 5 minutes now would be better. I'm very much in earnest when I make this request. Very well, said Miss Farnham in a light tone. Importunate people generally have their way. Come into the conservatory. There is a rose there on which I have set my heart. It is too high for me to reach. She left the room as she spoke, and Carlton quickly followed her. As they disappeared, I noticed more than one guest looking significantly after them. Carleton's pluck was distinctly approved of, and I could see that the expression of some of the ladies' face, and one as she passed close to Randall's side, was heard to murmur audibly, Faint heart never won fair lady. Randall came up to me and asked me to join him in a smoke on the balcony. As we walked up and down, he talked cheerfully, and whatever anxiety he may have inwardly felt, was careful not to betray a trace of it. In less than half an hour, Miss Farnham joined us. She was in a dark brown riding habit, which toned perfectly with her rich and splendid coloring. Her spirits were gay, not to say wild, and the warm, creamy whiteness of her face seemed to glow now with a hidden fire. Are you not ready for your ride? She said, looking at me with certain reproach. The horses will be round in less than 10 minutes. It is a splendid morning for a gallop. Are you coming too? She added, turning suddenly to Randall. I only waited for you to invite me, he said. Of course I shall come with pleasure. But I thought, he added in a low tone, coming close to her side as he spoke, that you arranged to ride with Ronald Carleton this morning. That is off, she replied in a light tone. Mr. Carleton has, I believe, another engagement. The balcony on which we were walking led round to one of the entrances of the house. At this moment, a groom is seen leading a smart mare up to the door. At the same time, Carleton ran down to the steps and sprang lightly into the saddle. Where are you off to? Exclaimed Randall, bounding out to the balcony to speak with him. Miss Farnham, Dr. Halifax, and I are going riding immediately. Won't you join us? Not this morning, I think, said Carleton, constraints in his tone. He gathered up his reins, and the mare began to prance about. You're holding her much too on the curb, said Randall. Thanks, I know what I'm about, replied Carleton, his evident temper. Be quiet, you brutes, be quiet, he continued, vainly endeavoring to restrain the movements of the impatient animal. I tell you the mare won't stand the curb, shouted Randall. Give her her head, and she'll do anything you ask her. I know, I've often ridden her. When I require a riding lesson from you, I'll inform you of the fact, answered Carleton in a sulky voice, which was rendered almost ridiculously by the frantic movements of the mare, now thoroughly upset. Miss Farnham, who had been standing in the background, came up at this juncture and took her place conspicuously by Randall's side. Mr. Randall is right and you are wrong, she exclaimed. It is absolutely cruel to ride that mare on the curb. Carleton looked up with a scowl, which anything but improved him. He would not even glance at Miss Farnham, but his eyes flashed an angry fire at his more fortunate rival. Of course Randall was right, he exclaimed. All the odds are in his favor. Nonsense, retorted Randall with heat. Come, come, gentlemen, pray don't quarrel on this lovely morning, said Miss Farnham. Mr. Carleton, I wish you a pleasant ride. She left the balcony as she spoke, and Randall and I immediately followed her example. We did a splendid ride over the extensive moorland country, and returned to lunch in excellent spirits and in a high good humor with each other. Carleton had not yet come back, but his absence did not seem to depress anyone, certainly not Miss Farnham, whose bright eyes and gay, animated manner made her the life of the party. Randall was radiant in the sunshine of her presence. She was confidential and almost affectionate in her manner with him, and he undoubtedly looked and was at his best. I could not help cordially liking him and thinking that the pair was well matched. Notwithstanding Robson's words on the night before, I had no doubt that Miss Farnham was sincerely attached to Randall, and would tell him so presently. I spent the greater part of the afternoon alone with my host, and did not see the rest of the guests until we met at dinner. Carleton had then returned. He sat between a red-haired girl and a very fat old lady, and looked distrait with bored as well as a man could. Randall, on the other hand, was in his best form. His clothes sat well on him. He was undoubtedly a handsome, striking-looking man. I cannot describe Miss Farnham's dress. It was ethereal in texture and suited her well. She was not seated in the neighborhood of either Randall or Carleton, but once or twice I noted that her eyes wandering down their part of the table. For some reason she was not in such high spirits as she had been earlier part of the day. My neighbor, a quiet, middle-aged spinster, began suddenly to talk to me about her. "I see you are interested in Barbara Farnham," she said. "I know I am not in the least surprised, but you followed the example of all the other men who know her." "Miss Farnham is a beautiful girl," I replied. Miss Derrick gave a short sigh. "Yes," she replied. "Barbara's too beautiful face. She is a fine creature, too, although, of course, terribly spoiled." "Have you known her long?" I asked. "Yes, since she was a child. Of course, you must notice, Dr. Halifax, the state of matters. Barbara's conduct is more or less the talk of the whole house. I presume from his manner that poor Mr. Charlton's chances of success are quite over, and, for my part, I am sorry. He is not rich, but he is a good fellow who is devotedly attached to Barbara, and his abilities are quite above the average." "Yes, I am very sorry for Mr. Carleton. Barbara might have done worse than return his affection." I did not feel inclined to pursue the subject any any further with this somewhat garrulous lady. After a pause, I remarked, "Miss Farnham looks tired. Does she not seem in her usual spirits?" Miss Derrick shrugged her thin shoulders. "What else can you expect?" she answered. "Barbara is a creature of moods. She was quite exalted all the morning. Now she will be correspondingly dull, until a fresh wave of excitement raises her spirits." At this moment, the signal for the ladies to withdraw was given. After their departure, Carleton and Randall found themselves sitting close together. I noticed that neither man spoke to the other, and also observed that after a time Carleton deliberately changed his seat for one of the distant part of the table. We did not sit long over wine, and when we came to the drawing-room, a lady was playing some classical music with a precision and sufficient brilliancy to attract several musical men to the vicinity of the piano. Her place was quickly taken by a droll man of the party, who entertained the company with comic songs. The evening dragged on in the usual manner. For some unaccountable reason, no one seemed quite in good spirits. As for me, I found myself constantly looking in the direction of the door. I hardly wished that either Carleton or Randall would come in. I acknowledged to myself that the presence of one at least of these gentlemen in the room would give me relief. An hour and more passed away, however, and neither of them appeared. I glanced round towards Mrs. Farnham. She was standing near the piano, idly playing with a large feather fan. I thought I read both her solitude and expectation in her eyes. The funny man was trolling out a season song, which to a lively chorus was attached. Robinson came up and touched my arms. "When that is over," he said in a low voice, "I will ask Barbara Farnham to sing." "Can she sing?" I asked. "Can she?" he reiterated. "Yes, she sings," he replied emphatically. "Wait, you will hear her in a moment. Her voice is the most absolutely sympathetic I have ever listened to." Soon afterwards, Miss Farnham went to the piano. She played her own accompaniments. One grand sweep of her hands seemed to take the instrument as if it were meant to embrace it. Then a high voice, a sweet magnificence in the volume and melody, rose into the air and seemed to fill the room. Brabazon was right. Barbara Farnham could sing, and the words fell from her lips. There was no other sound in the listening room. I jotted down those few words afterwards from memory. They seemed to me to be a prelude to the scene which was immediately to follow. "Thou hast filled me a golden cup with a drink divine that glows, with a bloom that is flowing up from the heart of the folded rose. The grapes in their amber glow, and the strength of the blood-red wine, all mingle and change and flow in this golden cup of thine, with the scent of the curling wine, with the balm of the rose's breath, for the voice of love is thine, and thine is the song of death." The voice of the singer sank low when it approached the end of her song. The final words were in a minor key. I looked full at Miss Farnham, and her dark eyes met mine. They were full of apprehension. A kind of premonition of coming sorrow might well have filled her breast from the look of those depths. There was a noise and sense of confusion in the outer drawing room. People stood back and made way for someone, and hurrying steps came quickly forward to the piano. Miss Farnham sprang to her feet, and the last notes of the song rested on her lips. Carleton, an overcoat covering his eyes, his evening dress, his hair disheveled, his eyes wild, had come hastily to her side. "You will think I have killed him, Barbara, but before God, it is not true," he said in a hoarse whisper. Then he grasped her. "Come, I want you," he said, and he dragged me, as if he were a young fury, out of the room. "What in the name of heaven is the matter?" I asked him when we found ourselves in the hall. "Randall has fallen over the cliff down Porn's field," he gasped. "I've found the body. Oh, no, what am I saying? Not the body yet, not a body when I left it. It breathes, it's just breathed when I left. I tried to drag it up here, but it was too heavy. Come at once, for the love of heaven!" Other people had followed us out of the drawing room. I encountered the glance of fire from Miss Farnham's dark eyes. Her face was like death itself. Brabazon, in a tone of full authority befitted the host, began to speak. "Come," he said. "Accident or no, there's not a moment to be lost in trying to help the poor fellow. You will lead us to the spot at once, Carleton. Come, Halifax. What a blessing that you have happened to be here on the spot." "Get some brandy and something which we can improvise a litter or shutter," I answered. "I'm going to my room to fetch my surgical case." I ran upstairs. A moment or two later, we were on our way to the scene of the accident. Every man of the party accompanied us, and several of the ladies. The foremost of the group was Miss Farnham herself. She had hastily flung a shawl over her head, and the train of her rich dinner dress was slung across her arm. She looked at Carleton, and with a peremptory gesture seemed to invite him to come to her side. He did so, and they rushed on, too quickly for many of the rest of the party to keep up with them. It was a bright, moonlit night, and we had scarcely a need for a lantern which Brabazon was thoughtful enough to bring with him. We had to go some distance to reach the spot where poor Randall was lying, but by and by we found him stretched partly on his back, partly rolled over to his left side, on a strip of sand which gleamed cold in the moonlight. "Yes, this is where I left him," exclaimed Carleton. He fell on his knees as he spoke and looked intently at the poor lad's face. "Thank God!" he exclaimed, holding up to me. "He can't be dead. I dragged him as far as this, and then left him lying on his back. See, he has moved. He is partly on his side now." I motioned Carleton to make way for me to approach. I felt for a pulse in the limp and powerless wrist. I laid my hand on the heart, then I gently raised my head and felt along the region of the skull. "You will give him a little brandy," exclaimed Brabazon. "Here's a flask." Miss Farnham took it out of Brabazon's hand, unscrewed it, and began to pour some into the cup. As she did so, she also knelt in the sand. I looked at her and felt that she would probably need a stimulant for which no avail could do now the dead. "It is all over," I said. "He's dead, poor fellow." As I spoke, I stretched my hand out and took the brandy flask from Miss Farnham. She looked wildly around, glanced at Carleton, gave a piercing cry, and then fell over Randall's body. She had completely lost conscious. I laid her flat on the sand, and applying some restoratives, and she quickly came back to her senses. The body of a dead man was lifted up and laid on some boards which we had brought with us, and we returned slowly to the house. Brabazon gave his arm to Miss Farnham, who truly needed it, for she staggered as she walked. I looked round for Carleton. There was a wild expression in his eyes which made me anxious about him. I saw, too, that he wished to linger behind the others. "Come," I said, going up to him. "This has given you a terrible shock. Why, you are as much overcome as Miss Farnham." I dragged his hand through my arm, and we followed in the rear of the sad procession. All the way up to the house he did not speak, nor did I trouble him with questions. I thought that his misery had made him dumb for the time being. In short, he was in a stunned condition. I dreaded, however, the return tide of strong emotion which must inevitably return to this apparent calm. I guessed that Carleton was a man of strong sensibilities. I could read character well. Most men in my profession have practice in the art. The human eye tells a doctor a good deal. The lips may falter out certain utterances which the eyes will belie. I read truth and sincerity in the honest eyes of this young man. He is intensely reserved. He was jealous to a morbid degree, but in all probability possessed anything but a good temper. Nevertheless, his eyes were honest, and I felt certain that he had nothing whatsoever to do with poor Randall's death. Nevertheless, I knew that, appearances were strongly against him. When we got to the house, I turned to him and said abruptly, "I should like to see you in Brabazon's smoking room in half an hour." He raised sullen eyes to my face. "Come," I said, laying my hand on his shoulder. "I tell you at once I do not believe that you killed the poor fellow, but we must talk the matter over. I am anxious to be your friend. It is absolutely necessary that you should confide in someone. I am unbiased in my views of the whole situation as a man can be. Come and talk to me in half an hour in the smoking room." He did not say a word, but I knew by the way in which he suddenly grasped my hand that he would come. The dead man was carried into the library, where he was laid reverently on a table. Brabazon then had the consultation with me as to the best means of breaking the news to Lord and Lady Hartmore. Poor Randall was their only son, and it was a terrible business altogether. And Brabazon was naturally greatly distressed. I asked after Miss Farnham. He told me that she had gone straight to her room. His tone was scarcely sympathetic, and I looked at him in wonder. "I have no patience with her," he exclaimed. "She has behaved very badly. This awful thing would not have occurred but for her. She has driven poor Carleton—" I put up my hand towards his words. "Hush," I exclaimed. "You surely don't." He laughed aloud at his agitation. "I surely do," he began. "There, Halifax, won't be a single name tonight. Of course, there must be a coroner's inquest." "Yes," I replied. "It is a terrible thing altogether," continued Brabazon. "And to think it's happening here. And to Randall, of all people, a man with his expectations. Well, it is a lesson which Miss Farnham may well go to her heart." We were standing together in the library. The hour was now nearly midnight. The body of the dead man lay on the center table, covered with a white sheet. There came a knock at the door, and to my dismay and astonishment I saw Carleton enter the room. "I heard voices and guessed you would be here," he exclaimed. "I have recovered my nerves to a certain extent, and wish to tell you, sir," looking at his host, "and you also, Dr. Halifax, exactly what had occurred." "Come into the smoking room," said Brabazon, not unkindly. "No," answered the poor lad. "If you will allow me, I will tell my story here. There's not much to tell, but there had be best in the presence of—" His lip trembled. He could not further a word sank out. He sank suddenly into a chair and covered his white face with his shaking hands. "We must humor him," I said, turning to speaking with whispered Brabazon. "And before God," I continued impulsively, "I believe he is innocent as I am." I drew forward a chair for myself as I spoke, but Brabazon stood by the hearth. Carleton began to speak directly. His emotion was quickly mastered. "I have loved Barbara Farnham for 2 years. At intervals she has given me great encouragement, and I had a fair hopes of winning her until she met Randall in this house a fortnight ago. This morning I felt desperate, and resolved to put my fortunes to the test. I asked her to give me an interview after breakfast, as you doubtless noted." He paused and looked at me. I nodded my head, and he continued. "I went to the conservatory, and I spoke to her. I told her the naked truth, perhaps a little too bluntly. I asked her if she was really meant to— No, I must not say what I did ask her. It is unfair to her. From her manner and her words, I plainly gathered that she preferred Randall to me, and that I had no chance whatsoever of winning her. Perhaps I lost my temper. Anyhow, it was unmanly of me to say what I did. I accused her of valuing Raoul's position. I told her plainly if Randall and I could change places, I should be the favored one. We had a disagreement, and our interview was full of pain, at least to me. When I left Miss Farnham, the evil one seemed to enter into me, and I hated Randall as I never knew I could hate anyone before. I would not ride with the others. Anyway, I went away to myself, and the whole day had been a long agony for me. My hatred to Randall grew worse and worse until the hints half frightened me. We used to be good friends, too. After dinner I felt that I could not bear a couple of conventional hours in the drawing-room, and went out to nurse my misery in the open air. I had no idea that Randall was also out. I went along by the shore, but mounted on the higher cliffs on my back. I intended to leave Prepperton early tomorrow, and felt impatient for the hour when I could get away from this loathsome sight of my successful rival. As I was walking along by the edge of the cliffs and had just entered Porn's Field, I felt my heart jump into my mouth, for Randall was coming to meet me. He was 100 yards away when I first saw him. He's a taller man than I, and he seemed to stand out sharply between me and the sky. I knew by his attitude that he was smoking a cigar. I stood still for a moment. I did not want to pass him. My heart was full of torment, and I hated to meet him out there, with not a soul to stand between us. You know that part of the cliff, Mr. Brabazon? Randall had just come to that portion of which is railed in to keep the cattle from tumbling over. I don't know what possessed him to take the outside path, which is very narrow and slippery, but he did so, however, and now, for the first time, he must have noticed me. I was within 50 yards of the man, also coming along the edge of the cliff. He stood stock still, as if something or somebody had shot him. I thought he was about to shout at me, but instead of doing so, he threw up one hand and clutched his brow. The next instant, he began to sway from side to side, and before I could approach him, he had fallen over the cliff, sheared down that awful height. My absolute surprise stunned me for a moment. Then I ran up to the spot where he had fallen, and throwing myself on my face and hands, looked over the cliff in hopes that he might have clung to something. The moon was bright, but I could not see him. Looking down from that height made me dizzy, and I saw there was nothing for it but to retrace my steps as fast as possible to the shore. I ran quickly and was breathless when I got back to him. He was lying on his back with his eyes stretched out. Some blood was oozing from his mouth. I wiped it away and called to him, and putting my arm under his head, tried to lift him. He moaned and moved faintly. I felt his limbs. They seemed all right. I had a wild hope that he was only stunned, and tried to drag him along the shore. He was too heavy for me, however, and I feared that I might only be injuring him in my attempt to get him back to the house. I laid him as easily as I could on the piece of sand above the high water mark, and then ran back to Penporn. It was on my way back that the awful idea first occurred to me that Barbara would think that I had killed him. I seemed to see all the circumstances of his terrible death with preternatural clearness, and I felt sure that the gravest suspicion would be attached to me. I have come to this room now to tell you both, before heaven and in the presence of a dead man, the solemn truth. Of course, I cannot compel you to believe me. Harlequin stood up as he uttered these last words. His attitude was very manly, and the look on his face was at once straightforward and quiet. I liked him better than I thought I could ever have liked him. I felt deep sympathy for him, and looked at Brabazon, expecting him to share my sentiments. To my surprise, however, I saw by the expression of his lips that he was not favorably impressed by Carleton, and that his feelings towards him were the reverse of sympathetic. Carleton looked full at him, expecting him to speak. When he did not, the poor fellow repeated his last remark, a faint quaver perceptible in his voice. Of course, I cannot compel you to believe me. Thank you for coming to see us, said Brabazon then. You have been the first to give name to a suspicion which will, doubtless, be harbored by more than one person who has known all the circumstances of this unhappy case. I sincerely pity you, Carleton, but I prefer to keep my judgment in the absence of the time being. Halifax would tell you that the coroner's inquest will be necessary. At the inquest, the whole matter will be gone carefully into. You may be certain that all possible justice will be done for you. Justice! Exclaimed Carleton, a faint smile playing from instant around his lips. Justice when there will be no witnesses! Oh, that dead man could speak! He turned abruptly and prepared to leave the room. Brabazon called after him. You must give me your word of honor that you will not attempt to leave Penporn before the inquest. You may rest assured on that point, said Carleton, and he left the room. The restraint he was putting upon himself gave a dignity to his whole bearing which impressed me much. I fully believe that that poor fellow was innocent, I said, as soon as the door had closed behind him. Brabazon gave me a keen glance. You are a good judge of character, he said after a pause. Still, I prefer to keep my judgments in abeyance. Shortly after, he bade me a good night, and I retired to my own room. I closed this door and stood by the fire. There, in the ashes of the fire, which had been lit some hours previous, had long go and burnt itself out, for it to be seen. I felt too restless to go to bed, and wished the morning would come. I was standing so, thinking over the circumstances which had turned our gay party into a mourning one, when I heard the footfall outside my door. I thought it might possibly be Carleton, and going across the room I opened the door and went out into the hall. To my astonishment, Miss Farnham, still wearing her gay evening dress, stood before me. I was thinking of knocking at your door, she said, but had scarcely courage to do so. I wish to speak to you. I will see you in the morning, I said.
It is morning already, she replied. There is no time for conventionality, Dr. Halifax. I wish to speak to you now. You cannot sleep, and no more can I. Please follow me to Miss Branson's sitting room, where a fire and lamp are still burning.
She led the way, and I obeyed her without a word.
Now tell me the truth, she
said, the moment we found ourselves within the room.
Will Mr. Carleton be accused of having murdered poor Arthur Randall?
There's no doubt that grave suspicion will be attached to him, I answered, without hesitation.
But you think him innocent?
She queried. I think him innocent. As innocent as you or I.
Oh, don't speak of me, she said, sinking suddenly to the sofa. Pray don't mention my innocence. But for me this tragedy would never have happened.
I looked long at her before I replied. In one sense you may be right, I answered. It is quite possible that, but for you, Carleton would have still not witnessed Randall's death. Still, you must not be unfair to yourself. You are not accountable for the sudden brain seizure which must have caused Randall to reel and fall over the cliff.
What do you mean?
She demanded. Carleton has just described to me the accidents represented to me, I answered. He saw Randall sway and fall over the cliff. I believe his story, although I fear few people will agree with me.
I don't know the story, she said faintly. Pray, tell it to me.
So I did, in a few words.
You believe all this?
She said with intense eagerness when I had done so speaking. Yes.
How do you account for Mr. Randall's death?
I could not help sighing deeply. You allude now to the difficulty of the position, I said. At the present moment, I cannot account for Randall's death. A man in perfect health is not often attacked with so violent vertigo as which caused him to lose power of keeping himself upright. Then I paused. I was thinking deeply. Undoubtedly, there have been such cases, I said, but they are rare. I remembered as I spoke Randall's change of color and the sudden pressure to his head he had given the morning at breakfast. You've seen a good deal of the poor fellow, I said. Did he ever at any time complain of particular symptoms to you? Did you ever notice anything about him which would lead you to suppose him not in perfect health?
Never, she said at once emphatically. He always seemed to me to be the perfect embodiment of the rudest health and strength.
The death is very mysterious, I said, and while I personally believe poor Carleton's story, I fear matters will go hard with him. I was about to leave the room, as I did not imagine Miss Farnham would have anything further to say to me, when she exclaimed impulsively, and her eyes filled with the most terrible anguish, her face turning white as death.
If indeed this thing is true, and if Randall Carleton has to suffer the consequences of Mr. Randall's death, I shall put an end to my own life.
Nonsense, I said sharply. You must not speak in that wild way. You know how you don't mean a word of that.
You mistake me, she replied. I exaggerate nothing. I state the simple fact that when I tell you that if Ronald Carleton suffers for this, my remorse will be greater than I can bear. I've behaved badly to him.
Yes, God knows you have, I interrupted. I felt quite angry with her, and she did not want to spare her at that moment. You have behaved badly to an honest and true-hearted man that ever breathed. When will beautiful women like you learn that men's hearts are not mere balls to be kicked here and there?
Oh, yes, you are right to abuse me, she said. Go on, go on. I am so unhappy that nothing you say will add to my pain. My cup of misery is full. I have ruined the man I love.
The man you love? I queried, looking at her in astonishment. Nay, you must not be too hard on yourself. You surely are not accountable for Randall's tragic end. If Carleton's story is true, he died from a sudden vertigo.
You were kind to him while he lived. You are nothing to reproach yourself on this score. Yes, I have, she answered with a sudden passion. I deceived him. I made him think that I loved him. In reality, he was nothing to me. It is Ronald Carleton whom I love. Then, in the name of the evil one, I began. Yes, you may say the quote of the evil one, she retorted. I think he has been about our house all day. I think he entered into me this morning when Ronald spoke to me. The evil one held me back from telling him what I really thought. I gave him to my understanding that I hated him. And I loved all the time. I loved him. I loved him then. I love him now. I shall love him forever. The dead man is nothing to me, less than nothing. She began to walk up and down the room. Fever spots burst on her cheeks. Her eyes looked wild. She clenched her right hand. What can I do for you? I asked after a pause. You have been good enough to confide in me. You must have done so for a reason. She stopped her restless walk and came close to me. I've heard of you before, Dr. Halifax, she said. This is not the first time you've been asked to help people in trouble. I want you to help me. Will you help me? With what power I have, if I can. You can. Find out what killed Mr. Randall. Save Ronald Carleton. I wish I could, I said reflectively. Oh, it won't be difficult, she replied. I looked at her in surprise. What can you mean, I asked. To my amazement, she flung herself at my knees. You can invent something, she said, clasping my hand and pressing it frantically between both of her own. Oh, if it would not be a crime, it would only save him 2 lives. Say you saw symptoms of apathy. Oh, you know what to say, and you are a great doctor, and you will be believed. Get up, I said sternly. I will forgive you your wild words, for circumstances have excited you so much that you do not quite know what you're saying. Believe me that nothing would give me more sincere satisfaction than to be able to discover the real cause of poor Randall's death. But you mistake your man utterly when you make the suggestion you do. Now I must leave you. It is almost morning, and I have promised to meet with Brabazon downstairs at an early hour. I went back to my own room, where I sat with anxious thought until the time which Brabazon had appointed for us at our next meeting. I went down to the smoking room, where I found him. He looked harassed and ill. No wonder. The subject we had met to discuss was how the best news of their only son's death was to be broken to Lord and Lady Hatmore. The Hartmore place was situated about 100 miles away. Brabazon was there, and was nothing whatsoever to do but telegraph that happy circumstance to them. And I fear doing so very much, he added, for Hartmore is not strong. He has a rather dangerous heart affection. Don't telegraph, I said impulsively. I will go and see them. You? Exclaimed Brabazon. That would be an immense relief. You will know what to break the news to the least startling way. I should have recommended you to see Lady Hartmore at first possible. She is a strong-minded woman and has a fine character, but at best the shock will be terrible. It is good to you, Halifax, to undertake so fearful a mission. Not at all, I replied. Will you come with me? I fear I cannot. My wife is very much shaken, and ought not to leave her with a house full of people. I suppose most of your guests will leave today? Probably. Still, for the time being, they are here. There will be an inquest which most are likely to take place today. I was going to propose, I said, that a post-mortem examination should precede the inquest. Brabazon raised his eyebrows, and he looked annoyed. Is that necessary? He asked. A post-mortem examination will only add needlessly to the sufferings of the unfortunate parents. In this case, surely, the cause of death is clearly defined, a fracture of the skull. The cause of death is clearly defined, I answered, but not the cause of sudden vertigo. Sudden vertigo, according to Carleton's account, corrected Brabazon. He did not say anything further for a moment, nor did I. After a pause, he continued, As you are good enough to say you will go to Tringdale,
I will ask you to take poor Randall's last letter with you. I went into his room yesterday evening and found one directed to his mother on the writing table. She will prize it, of course. Now I had better look up your train. He did so, and half an hour afterwards I was driving as fast as a pair of horses could take me to the nearest railway station. I caught an early train to Trigano, and arrived there between 9 and 10 that morning. A cab conveyed me to the castle, which stood in a little eminence above the sleepy-looking town. My errand was, in truth, a gloomy one. During the journey I had made up my mind for every reason to see Lady Hartmore first. When the servant opened the door, I asked for her, and giving the man my card, told him I wished to see his mistress alone on a matter of urgent importance. I was shown into a morning room, and in a very short time Lady Hartmore came in. She was a tall, fine-looking woman, with a likeness to her dead son about her kindly, well-opened eyes and pleasant mouth. My name and the message I had sent her was given to the servant that naturally startled her. She gave me a keen glance when she entered the room, which I returned with interest. I saw at once that her heart was strong enough, her nature brave enough to stand the full weight of the terrible calamity without breaking down. I have come to see you on a most painful matter, I began at once. I'm just now visiting the Brabazons in Penporn.
Then it is something about my son, she exclaimed instantly.
Her face grew very pale. She pressed her hand to her left side and looked hurriedly towards the door.
Lord Hartman may come in if you are not quick, she said. He was in the breakfast room when the servant brought me your card and message. Please tell me what you have got to say at once. I can bear the shock, but he cannot.
Poor wife. Poor mother. Her eyes looked at me with dumb entreaty, while her lips uttered the words with courage. Women like you, Lady Hartmore, I could always not help uttering impulsively, are always brave. It is my terrible mission to inflict a great blow upon you. Your son has met with an accident.
Is he dead?
She asked. She came close to me as she spoke. Her voice had sunk to a hoarse whisper. He is dead, I replied instantly. Sit down. I motioned her to a chair, and she obeyed me.
Lock the door, she said. Lord Hartman must not know of this quite yet.
I did as she asked, and then stood with my back to her in one of the windows. As I did so, I felt from my pocket the letter which Brasberton had given to me. It was not there. Then I remembered that in the excitement of my getting off time to catch the train, we must have both forgotten it. After a time, Lady Hartmore's voice, sounding hollow and low, reached my ears.
Tell me the particulars, she said.
So I did. I sat down near her and told them as briefly as possible. She listened intently. When I was finished, she said in a puzzled tone,
I cannot account for the sudden giddiness. Arthur has always had excellent health.
Then she looked at me full in the face.
Do you believe the story, Dr. Halifax?
I thought for a moment, and then I said emphatically, Yes, I believe it. She did not speak at all for the best part of a moment, and then she gave a heavy sigh.
After all, she said, the thing that affects us is the death. He is dead. The inevitable has overtaken him. It scarcely matters how it happened, at least not now. Not to me.
Pardon me, Andrew. It matters a great deal how it happened. The cause of your son's death will be a question of anxious investigation, of the gravest and most searching inquiries. I fully believe the story which Carleton told us last night, but there are others who must suspect him of foul play. It is possible, Lady Hartmore, that it is any way possible in the province of a woman so completely to get herself in this terrible moment of anguish, to live as another? You can do nothing now for the dead, but you can very well, for the living.
You mean for my husband?
She inquired. Not alone for your husband, not even principally for him,
You can do much for the man who was accused of the crime of having murdered your son. I can only repeat my firm conviction of his innocence, but the grounds of my belief at present go for nothing. Circumstances can prove a grave case against him. Your son, to all appearances, was attracted to the young girl that Carlton loved and loves. Yesterday morning, Carlton received a considered final rejection from Miss Farnham. She spent the day with your son. She gave him every encouragement. Carlton was morose, gloomy, and jealous. His jealousy and gloom were noticed by every member of our party. Carlton and your son both absented themselves from the drawing room after dinner. It was during that time that the accident which deprived your son of his life took place. There will, of course, be a coroner's inquest. At the inquest, the circumstances which I've just alluded to will come out, and there is no question but that Carlton will be arrested on suspicion and sent to trial, unless, indeed, you will help me.
How can I help you? She asked. What am I to do? You ask me to share your belief, which seems to me to be based on nothing. Suppose I cannot share it?
A silence fell for a moment. I will tell you what I want you to do, I said then. I want you to join me on insisting on having a post-mortem examination. She gave me a glance of horror.
Why?
She asked.
Why must the sleep of the dead be disturbed?
Before I could answer her, Lord Hartmore's voice was heard at the door. She was a brave woman, but at the sound of her husband's voice, her courage for a moment deserted her.
How can I break it to him? She gasped. Oh, please, don't leave me.
No, I said. I will stay with you. I unlocked the door myself, and a white-headed, feeble-looking man came querulously into the room. His wife rose to meet him. She put her arms around him and somehow conveyed the terrible tidings into his mind. I needed scarcely linger over an hour that followed. At the end of that time, I was accompanying the Hartmores back to Penporn. During the journey, my companions were almost completely silent. Lady Hartmore kept her veil down, and I felt sure wished to avoid speaking to me. The old lord was completely prostrated with grief. Not a word or hint had either parent given me in the slightest clue which I could insist on a post-mortem examination. Their son had evidently enjoyed perfect health during his brief life. I saw that circumstances were very black for Carlton. It was evening when we reached Penporn. Lord and Lady Hartmore went at once to a private suite of rooms which had been got ready for their reception. As soon as I could, I sought an interview with Brabazon. Most of our visitors have left us, he said, but Miss Farnham and, of course, Carlton remained. The inquest is to take place in the library at an early hour tomorrow morning. I was silent for a moment, and then I said abruptly, Even at the risk of annoying you, Brasberton, I must repeat my strong desire that a post-mortem should precede the coroner's inquest. Have you spoken to the Hartmores on the subject? Inquired Brabazon. I told him that I had mentioned my wish to Lady Hartmore. And what did she say? He asked. She shrank from the idea in horror, I was obliged to confess. You can scarcely blame her, said Brasberton. Why should the poor fellow's body be unnecessarily disturbed? The fact is, I have a great faith in your judgment, Halifax, but I think in the present instance you carry out your sympathy for Ronald Carleton too far. The cause of death in the case of poor Randall was so absolutely apparent that I do not think you will get a coroner to consent to a post-mortem. There is one thing that occurred to me, I said. If Randall met his death by violence, there would be some traces of struggle in the spot where he fell over. Randall would not tamely submit to murder. He was a big man and muscular. Has the path along the cliff been carefully searched? Yes, said Brasberton. There was no trace of anywhere of a struggle. A little blood has been discovered at a sharp point of a rock just where Carleton described the fall to have taken place. The marks of a heavy body being dragged in the sands above the high water mark have also been seen. All these evidences are, of course, I'm bound to say, quite consistent with Carleton's story. The blood on the rock indicates also the exact spot of the accident.
That there was a vault with the skull was broken, I said. By the way, you forgot to give me poor Randall's letter to his mother. Doubtless Lady Hartmore would like to have it without a moment's delay. Robinson started and put his hand in his pocket. I put the letter here, he said, intending to give it to you as you were starting. Of course, I forgot it. Here it is. No, though, there's nothing in my pockets. Surely I can't have dropped it anywhere. I know I put it there this morning. I rushed up to the poor man's room to fetch it just as Brougham was coming around. You did not give it to me, I said. The letter ought to be found. It may be in the utmost importance. What was in the coat you wore this morning? Yes, I have not been out all day. You don't know what a rush and confusion the whole place has been. You will look for the letter, won't you, Brasberton? I cannot quite tell you why, but it will give me a sense of relief to know that it has been found before the inquest takes place tomorrow morning. Soon afterwards we parted. I went into one of the morning rooms and found Mrs. Braswell. I made inquiries with regard to Carleton and Miss Farnham.
I have not seen either of them, replied my hostess. I believe Carleton had spent the day in his room. A servant told me that Barbara Fenham was not well. I hear she has not risen at all today.
Poor girl, I ejaculated. Miss Brasberton looked at me with languid interest. She was a very lethargic person.
Yes, she ejaculated after a pause. This tragedy will be a sad blow to Barbara. She is as ambitious as she is handsome. She would have made a regal-looking Lady Hartmore.
I said nothing further. I could not betray the poor girl's secret, nor let Miss Brasberton know what a small place, high position, and greatness occupied just now for Miss Brasberton. Almost heart from thoughts. Just before the inquest the next morning, I found Brasberton if the missing letter had been found. No, he said, I cannot tell you how vexed I am about it. Every conceivable hole and corner, both in the house and outside, have been searched, and no trace of the letter has been discovered. What I fear is that when I went down to the shore yesterday, making investigations, I may have dropped it out of my pocket and been washed away with the incoming tide. I can't think of any other cause for its absolute disappearance. I beg of you, Halifax, not to say anything to Lady Hartmore about it at the present. Of course not, I answered, in some surprise at the request. I then ran upstairs. I must, of course, be present at the inquest, but I had still had a moment at my disposal. I went boldly to Miss Farnham's door and knocked. After a brief pause, she opened it herself and stood before me. She was fully dressed. Her face was of a dead white. All the beautiful warmth of color had fled.
I am told I must be present at the inquest, she said. It is time for me to go downstairs. Have you come to fetch me?
She shuddered visibly as she spoke. I have come to ask you to help me, I said eagerly. I will manage to account for your absence in the library. Put on your hats. I want you to go out with me at once.
What do you mean? She asked in astonishment.
I will tell you, I said. On the day of his death, Randall wrote a letter to his mother. That letter has been lost. Brasberton had it in his pocket when he dropped it. No one knows where. There is no saying, Miss Farnham, which important evidence may the letter contain. I'm sure it is not on the house. Brasberton believes he dropped it when exploring the coast yesterday. You will go with me at once to look for it. The moment you discover it, will bring it to the library. I'll be as quick as ever as you can.
Yes,
she replied, the soul in her eyes leaping up with sudden renewed joy. She turned, pinned a hat on her head, and wrapped a shawl around her and ran downstairs. Her woman's wit grasped the whole situation at a glance. I went to the library, feeling assured that poor Mr. Randall's letter was still in existence. Miss Farnham was sure to find it. There were present in the inquest Lady Hartmore, Brabazon, and his wife, Carleton, and two gentlemen who had not yet left the house. Also, of course, the coroner and the jury. The moment I entered the room, I glanced at the coroner. I had not seen him before. He was a little old gentleman with a somewhat irascible expression of face, with a testy manner. I looked from him to poor Carleton, whom I had not seen since the time he had told his story in the room. The body of the dead man had been placed in a shell and still occupied the central table of the library. Lady Hartmore sat near it, the sheet covered the face of her dead. Once I saw her raise her hand and touch the sheet reverently. she had the attitude of one who protecting the body from intended violence. The position and look of her face reminded me of Rispa. I looked again from her to Carleton. It was necessary for me to glance at the poor fellow and to notice the despair on his face, to enable me to go up to the coroner and urge upon him the necessity for a post-mortem preceding the inquest. He did not take my suggestion kindly. "The case of death is adamantly evident," he said with irritation. "I cannot counsel a post-mortem examination."
"And I will not hear of it,"
said Lady Hartmore, looking at me with eyes full of reproach.
"Pray say nothing more about it,"
exclaimed Carleton. I bowed and sat down. The inquest was conducted with extreme care, but soon Miss Farnham's presence was found necessary, and her absence commented upon. I saw Carleton start when her name was mentioned. A look of extreme distress filled his eyes.
"I will go to find her,"
said Miss Braswitton, leaving the room. She returned in a moment to say that Miss Farnham was not in her room, and that no one seemed to know anything about her.
"I have sent several servants into the grounds to look for her," she said.
As Miss Farnham was an important witness, having spent almost the entire day previous to his death with Brian, proceedings were delayed during her absence. The case, however, seemed as black as could be for Carleton, and I had not the least doubt that the coroner would order a warrant to be issued for the arrest on suspicion. My one last hope now hung in Miss Farnham's being able to find the missing letter, and then on the letter containing the evidence which would give a medical cause for poor Randall's extraordinary death. I seldom found myself in more torturing position than during the time of an inquest. The relief, however, was at hand. I heard the sound of light and quickly moving feet in the hall. The door of the library was opened, not softly and with reverent hush, but with eager, impetuous movement of someone in hot haste. Miss Farnham came into the room, wild with color in her cheeks, and a wild, bright light in her eyes. Her skirts were dragging and wet, and her hair was loosened and falling over her shoulders. She had cast away both hat and shawl.
"There," she said, going straight up to Miss Hartman. "There's your letter, the last letter your son ever wrote to you. It was lost, or supposed to be lost, but I found it. I walked along the cliff close to the edge, very close. There was a part where the cliff was undermined. I lay on my face and hands and looked over. I saw far below a tiny ledge of rock. There's a bush growing there, and sticking out of the bush, something white. It might have been a useless rag or a piece of torn paper, or it might have been some letter of importance. The tide was coming in fast, still I thought I had time. I put wings on my feet and rushed down the narrow path that led to the beach below. The tide had already come up and was wetting the base of the rock above which the bush was containing the letter. I waded through the water and climbed to the cliff and got the paper. I scrambled down again. When I came back to the water, it was up to my knees, and I crossed it safely and mounted the higher cliff again. Then for the first time I examined my prize. Yes, it was a letter. It was open. I don't know what has become of the covering. I sat on the grass and I read it. Yes, I read every word. Here it is now. You can read it. Read it aloud, please, for it's important. It explains everything. It saves... Ronald, it saves you.
Here the excited girl paused in her eager narrative and turned her full gaze upon Carleton, who was bending over to listen to her.
It saves you, she repeated. It exonerates you completely.
The commotion which which Miss Farnham's words and manner excited could be better felt than described. Lady Hartmore stood up and confronted the breathless girl. She held out her hand and clutched the letter, which was torn and dirty from its long exposure to the wind and weather. She held it close and looked at it. It was the beloved handwriting of the dead. The dead man was her only son, and the letter was addressed to her, his mother. It contained the last message from the brain, now silent, from the heart, now still. Tears filled her eyes.
I must read this letter in private, she faltered. This last letter of my boy's is too sacred for anyone but his mother to hear. I must read it alone.
No, interrupted Miss Farnham. It contains important information. I will call upon the coroner to insist of it being read aloud. I risk my life to get it. Another life hangs in the information it contains. Miss Dr. Halifax, you are a medical man. Will you insist on this letter being read aloud? I went up to Lady Hartmore and said something to her in a low voice. She listened attentively. She considered my words, and after a moment she put the letter into my hands. If it must be, it must, she said. This is the last drop of bitterness in my cup. She sat down and, flinging out her two arms, stretched them over the body of the dead man. Once more her attitude and manner reminded me of Ursula. Miss Farnham stood close to Lady Hartman. She forgot her disheveled hair and her disordered appearance. All her soul filled her eyes, and she raised expectantly to her face. I glanced hurriedly through the letter, then I spoke. There's a good deal on this sheet of paper which is strictly private, I said, and need not be read for the benefit of the coroner and the jury. But there are some sentences referring to the state of Mr. Randall's health, which are, as Miss Farnham remarked, of the most importance. I'll now proceed to read that portion of this letter. I did so in a loud, clear voice. These were poor Randall's words. As far as I can tell, I am in perfect health, but for the last week or so I have been suffering at intervals of a strange form of giddiness. I feel as though I were made to turn around and round, and against my will impelled to go forwards or backwards or to one side. Sometimes the giddiness takes another form. I fancy that objects are revolving around me. I am perfectly conscious at all times, but the giddiness is generally accompanied by a distant sensation of nausea. Very often that act of closing my eyes removes the vertigo completely from me for the time being. When the attack goes off, I feel perfectly well, only I fancy I am suffering from continued deafness in my right ear. I don't know why I am impelled to tell you this. It is not worth making a fuss over. If I were to consult a medical man, he would probably set it down to a form of indigestion. I had a slight attack this morning at breakfast. If it continues or gets worse, I will take the opportunity of consulting a London doctor who happens to be in the house with us. I did not read any more, but folding up the letter, returned it to Lady Hartmore. Both Carleton and Miss Farnham had approached each other in their excitement. I looked beyond them to the coroner. I'm sure, I said, that I now express Lady Hartmore's sentiments as well as my own, when I demand that the inquest be adjourned until a post-mortem examination. The symptoms which he describes in the letter which I have just read aloud distinctly point to a disease of the inner ear, well known to the medical faculty, although not a common occurrence. I will ask the coroner to take immediate steps to get the services of 2 independent doctors to conduct the post-mortem, at which I should wish to be present. My words were followed by a slight pause. The coroner then agreed to my wishes, and the inquest had been adjourned. The post-mortem took place the afternoon of the same day, and the results amply accounted for the strange symptoms which poor Randall had so faithfully described in his last letter to his mother. On the right side of that portion of the base of the skull which contained the delicate organs of hearing, we found a small, bony excrescence growing down within the labyrinth of inner ear. This, though small, was undoubtedly the cause of the terrible attacks of vertigo which the poor fellow had complained about, and in one which he met his tragic death. The coroner's inquest was resumed on the following day, and of course, Carleton was abundantly exonerated. It was 2 years afterwards, however, I accidentally saw the Times announce of his marriage to Miss Farnham. Okay, I may not be able to do 2 of those stories tonight. That was long. Yeah, thank you for coming in, Legacy, and thank you for the raids, Oni. That was a really engrossing story. And hi, Evie. Thank you for coming in. I did not hear the spooky whispers. I'm not sure why.
You're sick, Legacy? That's sad to hear. I hope you get to feel better. Let's see, I usually stop at 11, but seeing as how long that story is, I'm not sure if I'd be able to get another one in. Especially since, let's see. Let's see begins. What is the story? It is 16 pages. It is actually longer than this one. Okay. I do thank everyone for coming in. Because I do like reading stories, and I really do like having people pop in. But I think I will probably stick with just one for tonight. Because it is hot, and I have too many lights on right now. So let's see who might be on that we can raid. Don't see anyone else reading. No. Nobody's reading. Someone's already playing Finding Cinderella. That's not fair. I wanted that one. I haven't entered a contest to get extras on it. Oh, wait. Papa Penguin's playing. Dodo. Let's see. I did see one other person on here. Let's see what they're doing before I raid. There we go. Ah, someone's reading Dune. He's got a fun background going right now. Now let's go ahead and read him. Hey, Taka. Oh, I did. Oh, dang it. I missed it. Oh well. Let us go ahead and read. Put the message up. Followers, raid for subs. We're going to raid Fox. Gentle Fox ASMR. He's reading Dune right now, and he's got his background set up really interesting, so let's go check in on him and hear another good, fairly classic tale. Copying on raid message. Okay. So again, thank you everyone for stopping by, and thank you for the raid and everything else, Oni. I did do the head scratch and hydrate and stretches. So I hope you all have a wonderful night, and I will see you over at Fox's. Good night, everyone.